How History Has Affected Women's Fashion Throughout the 20th Century by Maeva Nguono. On the left side, I have questions I'll be answering throughout this presentation. When looking at the history of fashion, I did not only look at what women were wearing and when they were wearing them, I also looked at what was happening around them when these clothings were developed to get a better understanding of the whole picture, which is the history of fashion. At times of each decade, there were clothings most women wore. Those are the clothing that will be featured on the appropriate slide, and those are also the clothing we'll be talking about. Having a certain fashion trend for each decade, women have to reflect, regardless of their age, height, weight, and so much more can affect the women's mental, physical, and even social health. The First World War broke in the 1910s. 40% of the decade there was a war going on. Obviously, the war had a huge effect on what women were wearing and doing throughout the decade. The previous decade and the beginning of 1910s fashion had an emphasis on the bust. Corsets were a must, and the idea was for a woman to have an S-shaped look, featured on the right. After the war, women wore a more natural shape but kept the waist cinching, bonnets, and medium heel shoes. The ratification of the 19th Amendment is completed, declaring the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, meaning you have the right to vote regardless of your sex. The 19th Amendment helped women in all aspects of life. They were closer to equality than ever. Women started advocating for themselves, for equal job opportunities, fairer wages, education, birth control, and so much more. With this, they started to wear more relaxing clothes, since the corsets practically immobilized them. They also started wearing more work clothes, since more of them were starting to get into the work industry. As women were getting more into the workforce, fashion designers like Coco Chanel took what men wore to work and altered them for women. The rest of the decade's fashion was highly influenced by what was seen on television, since TV was invented in 1927. The 1930s were known as the golden age of Hollywood because of how much film Hollywood was producing and airing. Towards the end of the decade, 1929, the stock market crashed, which led to the U.S. Great Depression. Obviously, this didn't have a big impact on the fashion's decade, but it will on the next decade. Because of the Great Depression and World War II, there was a shortage of fabric, which led to the creation of pencil skirts. Skirts lost a lot of pleats, which took up more fabric than needed, especially during a time of desperation and need. Excessive decoration on clothes were toned down significantly. Clothes were now more plain, light, and classic. During this decade, everything was going back to normal. The industries were thriving. The highest year for the baby boom were during the 1950s. People were settling down and having a family. Men mostly work and women stayed at home. The delicacy look are women making themselves look pretty before men return home from work. 1 in 3 women did work, and for work they wore what's on the left here. They look fairly similar to what women wore even when they stayed at home, with slight modifications. In 1960, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, made the first commercially produced birth control ever. This allowed women to control when and if they had children. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed a law for equal pay between men and women. This allowed women to get the same job as men in the workforce. Then, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs a civil right that bans discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and national origin. This was huge. The number rose to 38% of women who worked in the 1960s. Most worked as secretaries, teachers, and nurses. President Richard Nixon signed Title IX, saying there shouldn't be any discrimination towards a person because of their sex in an education program activity that is federally funded. In Roe v. Wade, the U.S. Supreme Court Constitution protects women's right to an abortion. The amount of women working rose to 43%. Women were more independent and seen on television without husbands, boyfriends, and children. Women used television to express problems they felt were crucial in the United States. This decade was known as the Green Decade. The 80s was the decade for fashion. It was known for the puffy hair, colorful clothes, and makeup. The styles were bold and so different. There were many styles, not just one mainstream like all the other decades. The 80s was the decade of independence. Over 50% of women were in the workforce. In 1994, Bill Clinton signs the Violence Against Women Act to be part of the Violent Crime Control and an enforcing act to provide help against domestic violence, rape, sexual assault, stalking, and more gender-related violence. The 90s were known for the new technology, new music, movies, television, and its unique fashion trend. The bell-bottoms in the 90s were recycled from the 70s. The 90s fashion was so different. It varied from mini skirts to tight pants to turtleneck sweaters to so much more. The 2000s fashion was highly influenced by the music culture. A lot of fashion recycled from the 60s. Hip-hop was very popular and dominated the music industry. Artists influenced the style being worn by people. The 2000s style was more relaxed, as you can see from the jeans on the screen, and the relaxed style screamed hip-hop. Designers often take fashion inspiration from previous centuries. Fashion is recycled from designer to designer with minimal changes. Fashion used to be recycled every 30 years, now it's sped up to 20 years. We even see these styles recycling back today. Today's fashion is mostly inspired by the 90s. The whole cycle is faster, not just the fashion coming back. The faster fashion quote-unquote comes back, the faster it quote-unquote leaves. Madonna is the most successful female artist of all time. She sold over 215 million records and has a net worth of over $800 million. Marilyn Monroe came from a poor neighborhood and became one of the most successful actresses, models, and singers. Florence Nightingale changed how medicine and medical service were brought across. Katharine Hepburn, best known as an actress who was leading in Hollywood for more than 60 years. Audrey Hepburn, a British actress and a fashion icon, was voted the most beautiful woman of the century. Coco Chanel, a women's fashion designer in the 20th century. Chanel took traditionally male clothes and altered them for women. Eleanor Fagan, also known as Billie Holiday, greatest/most expressive jazz singer of all time. Marie Curie, a French physicist who helped develop X-ray machines. And last but not least, Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of President F.D. Roosevelt, was an American political figure, diplomat, and activist. Fashion isn't always seen as something more, but I believe it tells us more about the time, the values, what the people did, and so much more. Thank you for watching.